The screaming started 3 nights ago, and nobody in Timber Ridge would go near the old Fairchild place anymore. Alice Fairchild heard it too, that awful sound coming from beneath the floorboards of her own home. And when the Cherokee warrior named a pony Darkwater finally tore those planks apart with his bare hands, what he pulled out changed everything she thought she knew about her husband's death. The town of Timber Ridge sat in a valley where the Smoky Mountains pressed close enough to touch the sky. It was October 1867, and the air carried the sharp bite of coming winter. Alice Fairchild stood at her kitchen window, watching the last light drain from the western hills. Her hands were deep in dishwater, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. 3 days. 3 nights. The sounds had started small at first, just a scratching that she'd blamed on rats or wind. But last night, she'd heard it clearly. A voice calling from somewhere beneath her feet. She'd told herself she was imagining things. Grief did that to a person, made them hear voices where there were none. Her husband Daniel had been dead 6 months, killed in what the sheriff called a hunting accident up in the high country. She and her son Benjamin were alone now, trying to hold together a farm that was slowly falling apart. Daniel's brother Martin came by every few weeks, always with that sympathetic smile, always offering to help. But his help came with conditions, suggestions that maybe Alice should sell and move back east. The scratching came again. Alice's hands went still in the water. It was louder this time, more insistent, coming from beneath the kitchen floor. She dried her hands slowly, heart hammering against her ribs. Benjamin was outside splitting wood. She could hear the steady thunk of the axe hitting the chopping block. The boy was trying so hard to be the man of the house now, trying to fill his father's boots, even though they were still miles too big. Alice crossed to the cellar door and pulled it open. The stairs descended into darkness, and the smell that rose up made her stomach turn. Damp earth and something else, something wrong. She lit a lantern with trembling hands and started down, each step creaking under her weight. The wood was old, installed by Daniel's grandfather 40 years ago, and it groaned like it remembered every footstep. The cellar was small and cluttered with barrels of salted pork, sacks of flour, and jars of preserves that gleamed like jewels in the lamplight. Apple butter, pickled beans, tomatoes put up last summer when the world had still made sense. The floor was hard-packed dirt, swept clean every week because that's what her mother had taught her. The scratching stopped the moment her feet touched the ground. Alice held the lantern higher, her breath misting in the cool air. "Hello." Her voice sounded small and foolish. "Is someone there?" Silence answered her. Just the drip of water somewhere in the darkness and the rapid thud of her own pulse. She moved forward carefully, boots scuffing on the packed earth. Then she saw it. One of the floorboards overhead had a gap along its edge. Not much, just enough to let through a sliver of light. And in that gap, something pale pressed against the wood. Fingers, small fingers, child-sized, pushing uselessly against the plank. A sound came with it, low and broken, like an animal caught in a trap. Alice stumbled backward, the lantern swinging wildly. The light caught the edge of those fingers again, thin and filthy, nails torn and bleeding. She ran, up the stairs, heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Through the kitchen, knocking over a chair. Out into the yard where Benjamin was stacking split logs. He looked up when he heard her coming, his 14-year-old face creasing with concern. He had Daniel's eyes, that same steady brown that could see right through a lie. "Ma, what's wrong?" His hand still held the axe, and for a moment, Alice saw her husband standing there instead. Alice grabbed Benjamin's shoulders, her breath coming in gasps. "Get the sheriff. Right now. Don't ask questions, just go." Her fingers dug into his shirt. "Ride fast, Benjamin. As fast as the mare can carry you." The boy's eyes went wide. He'd never seen his mother like this, wild-eyed and shaking. "Ma, what happened?" Are you hurt? Go. She pushed him toward the barn, harder than she meant to. Saddle the mare and ride. Don't come back without the sheriff. Don't stop for anything or anyone. You understand me? Benjamin nodded, dropping the axe and running. Alice stood in the yard, watching him disappear through the barn doors. A moment later he emerged, mounted and already moving. The mare's hooves threw up clods of dirt as they raced down the road. Alice stood there until horse and rider disappeared around the bend. Then she turned back to the house. She should wait for the sheriff. That was the sensible thing. But whoever was down there had been there for 3 days at least. 3 days without food or water, trapped in the dark with no one to hear their cries but her. She went to the barn and found Daniel's old crowbar hanging on the wall. The metal was cold and heavy in her hands. She carried it back to the house, set her jaw, and went to work on the kitchen floor. The planks were thick oak, nailed down tight by men who'd built to last. It took all her strength to wedge the crowbar under the first one and pry it up. The nails shrieked as they pulled free. The board came loose with a crack that echoed through the empty house. The smell hit her immediately. Unwashed flesh, human waste, the copper tang of blood. Alice gagged and turned her face away, breathing through her mouth. When she looked back, she could see into the narrow space between the floor and the root cellar ceiling. It was maybe 2 feet high, a crawl space that ran beneath the entire kitchen. She'd never known it was there, and in that space, pressed against the far wall where the lamplight barely reached, was a child. Alice's heart stopped. The boy was maybe 8 or 9, thin as a rail, his face streaked with dirt and tears and dry blood. His eyes were huge in the lamplight, wild with fear and hope. He tried to speak, but only a croak came out. "Oh God." Alice's voice broke. She dropped the crowbar and fell to her knees. "Oh God, sweetheart, hold on. I'm going to get you out." She tore at the next plank with her bare hands, not caring about the splinters. The boy watched her work, his breath coming in shallow pants that rattled in his chest. When she'd pulled up 3 more boards, the gap was wide enough. Alice reached down. "Can you move? Can you reach my hands?" The boy tried. She could see him struggling, his thin arms stretching up toward her. But something was wrong. He could only lift himself a few inches before falling back with a cry of pain. Alice looked closer and saw the rope. Thick hemp, the kind used for tying horses. It was wrapped around the boy's left ankle, the other end secured to a support beam. Someone had put him there. Someone had tied him up like an animal and trapped him beneath her kitchen floor. The rope had cut deep into his skin, the flesh raw and weeping. "Who did this to you?" Her voice shook with rage now. "Who put you here?" The boy just shook his head, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. He said something in a language she didn't recognize, words that sounded like water over stones. Cherokee, she realized. Alice grabbed the rope and pulled, but the knot was too tight, drawn cruelly close by days of struggling. She needed a knife. She was turning to get one when she heard the horse. Hoofbeats coming fast up the road, but not from town. From the opposite direction, from the mountain trail. Alice froze, listening. One horse, one rider, moving with purpose. The rider came into the yard at a gallop and swung down before the horse had fully stopped. Alice saw him through the window, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with fluid grace. He wore buckskin leggings and a dark shirt. His long black hair was tied back with leather, and even from a distance she could see the knife at his belt, the rifle in the saddle scabbard Cherokee. Her hand went instinctively to Daniel's rifle by the door. But he wasn't looking at the house. He was looking at the barn, at the fresh marks where Benjamin had ridden out. Then his gaze swung to the house, and Alice saw his face clearly. Strong features, high cheekbones, eyes the color of dark honey. And in those eyes, something fierce and urgent. He started toward the house with long strides. Alice grabbed the rifle and met him at the door, the weapon raised. "That's far enough. State your business or turn around and ride out." The man stopped. He held up both hands, showing they were empty, but his eyes never left hers. "My name is Pony Darkwater. I'm tracking someone. 2 white men. They came through here 3 days ago." His voice was deep and carried careful precision. "I haven't seen anyone." It wasn't quite a lie. She hadn't seen them. But 3 days ago, Martin had been here. They were carrying a child. Pony's eyes never left hers. "A boy. They took him from his family up in the high country. I've been following their trail for 8 days. The trail leads here." Behind her, from the open gap in the kitchen floor, came a soft whimper. Pony's head snapped toward the sound. His whole body went rigid. What was that? His hand dropped to the knife at his belt. "Nothing. You need to leave. The sheriff is coming." But he was already moving, pushing past her. Alice swung the rifle up, but he was faster. He caught the barrel and pulled it from her hands in one smooth motion, then tossed it aside. Before she could scream, he was across the room, staring down at the torn-up floor. "Jesus!" The word came out rough with emotion. Then he was on his knees, looking down into the crawl space. "Weah!" His voice changed completely, became gentle. "Weah, it's me. It's Uncle Pony. I'm here. I'm going to get you out." The boy in the crawl space made a sound, half sob and half cry of relief. He said something in Cherokee, the words tumbling over each other. Pony answered in the same language, his voice low and soothing. Alice stood frozen. Watching this exchange she couldn't understand. Pony reached down into the gap, his large hands surprisingly gentle. "He's tied," Pony said, switching back to English. "I need something to cut the rope. A knife, scissors, anything sharp." Alice found her voice. "Who is he?" "My nephew." Pony's hands worked quickly now, checking the boards, measuring the gap. "His name is Weah. He was taken from his mother's home 8 days ago. 2 white men broke in at night. One tall with a scar running down his face, the other shorter, red-haired." "Did you see them?" "Red-haired." Alice felt the blood drain from her face. "No, I don't know how he got here. I didn't know anyone was under my house." But even as she said it, her mind was racing. 3 days ago, Martin had come by. He'd stayed less than an hour, but he'd gone into the house. And Martin was red-haired. Oh no. The words escaped before she could stop them. Pony looked at her sharply, his honey-colored eyes suddenly hard. "What?" Alice's hands shook. "My brother-in-law. Martin Fairchild. He was here 3 nights ago. Said he needed tools, but he came inside. I didn't see anyone with him, but I wasn't watching closely. I was making supper, and Benjamin was in the barn." Shame and horror flooded through her. If he did this, where is he now? Pony's voice was flat, without inflection. It was somehow more frightening than if he'd shouted. "I don't know. He has a place up in the hills, about 5 miles north. An old trapper's cabin. He goes up there sometimes, says he's hunting." Alice's voice cracked. "But why would anyone steal a child and hide him like this? Money." Pony stood up slowly, and Alice took an involuntary step back. He was bigger than she'd realized. "There's a man in Nashville who pays for Cherokee children. $200 a head. Ships them east on the railroad, sells them as indentured servants or worse. Your brother-in-law and his partner have taken 3 children in the past month." He looked back down at Weah. "Weah is the first one I've found alive." Alice felt sick. Her legs gave out, and she sank into a chair, her whole body trembling. All this time, while she'd been mourning Daniel, while she'd been struggling to keep the farm running, a child had been suffering beneath her feet, trapped, starving, screaming into the darkness. And Martin had done it. Martin with her sympathetic smiles and his offers to help. I need that knife. A pony's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Alice got up mechanically and went to the drawer where she kept Daniel's hunting knife. She handed it to a pony. He took it and began prying up more boards, widening the gap until he could lower himself into the crawl space. Alice watched from above as he cut the rope around Weya's ankle, then gathered the boy carefully into his arms. The child was so light. That was what struck her most. He should have weighed more. But he was nothing but skin and bones. Help me, a pony said, lifting Weya up through the gap. Alice took the boy's weight, pulling him up onto the kitchen floor. His skin was cold, clammy with fever. His ankle was raw and bleeding where the rope had cut into the flesh. A pony pulled himself up after his nephew, moving with economical grace. He knelt beside Weya, checking him over with gentle hands, running his fingers over the boy's arms and legs, checking for breaks, listening to his breathing. The boy's eyes fluttered open, and he said something in Cherokee, his voice barely a whisper. A pony answered, his own voice thick with emotion, and Alice saw tears tracking down his face. He needs water, a pony said without looking at her. And food, but not too much at first. His stomach won't be able to handle it. Just broth if you have it, or milk watered down. Nothing solid yet. Alice brought water in her best china cup. She knelt beside them and watched as a pony helped Weya drink, supporting the boy's head, murmuring encouragement. The child took tiny sips, his throat working painfully. I'm sorry. Alice's voice was barely audible. I should have known. I should have heard him sooner. I did hear him, but I thought it was rats. You heard him when it mattered. A pony looked at her, his expression softening slightly. That's what counts. Many people would have ignored the sounds. You didn't. You came down here and started tearing up your own floor to reach him. That took courage. He stroked Weya's hair back from his forehead. We need to get him to safety. And we need to find your brother-in-law before he takes another child. The sheriff is coming. My son Benjamin went to fetch him. Alice stood up, her legs still unsteady. A pony shook his head. I'm not waiting. I know where that cabin is. I've been tracking these men for 8 days. They'll move again soon, maybe tonight. If I wait for your sheriff and his questions, they'll be gone. He stood, lifting Weya easily in his arms. I'm going there now, then I'm coming with you. The words were out before Alice had fully formed the thought. A pony stared at her. What? Alice grabbed Daniel's gun belt from its peg and buckled it around her waist. The weight of the revolver was familiar, almost comforting. Daniel had taught her to shoot when they'd first married. She'd always been a good student. My son Benjamin. He's 14 and looks young for his age. If Martin is taking Cherokee children for money, what's to stop him from taking white children too? Her hands were steady now as she checked the revolver's load. I won't let that happen. This isn't your fight. But a pony's tone had changed, held something that might have been respect. It became my fight the moment Martin used my home as a prison. Alice met his eyes directly. He made me complicit in his crimes. He turned my house into a place of suffering. I won't let him get away with that. I won't let him do this to another family. She grabbed her heavy coat. I'm coming with you. A pony studied her for a long moment. His honey-colored eyes seemed to see right through her, weighing and measuring. Then slowly, he nodded. All right. But when we find him, you let me handle it. Understood? Understood. Alice looked at Weya. What about him? There's a woman in town, Mary Whitehorse. She married a settler but still keeps Cherokee ways. She'll care for him until I return. A pony moved toward the door. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats announced Benjamin's return. Alice stepped onto the porch as her son rode up with Sheriff Davis close behind. The sheriff was a weathered man in his 50s, gray-bearded and cautious by nature. His face creased with confusion when he saw a pony Darkwater with a Cherokee boy in his arms. "Alice, what in God's name is going on here?" "Sheriff Davis, this is a pony Darkwater. The child is his nephew. His name is Weah." Alice's voice was steady now, cold with purpose. "Martin Fairchild kidnapped him 8 days ago and hid him under my kitchen floor 3 days ago. We're going after Martin tonight. You can come with us or you can stay here." The sheriff's hand dropped to his gun. "Now hold on just a minute. Martin murdered this boy's mother." A pony's voice cut through the sheriff's protest. "Cut her throat and left her bleeding out while he stole her son. He's been kidnapping Cherokee children and selling them to a man in Nashville. $200 per child. If we don't stop him tonight, he'll run." Sheriff Davis looked from Alice to a pony, to the unconscious child. Alice could see him thinking, weighing his options. Finally, he sighed and adjusted his gun belt. "All right. But we do this legal. We bring him in and he stands trial." "Agreed." A pony's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Alice thought he might refuse. Then he nodded curtly. "Agreed. As long as he faces justice." "Benjamin," Alice said, turning to her son. His face was pale. "Take Weah inside. Get him warm by the fire. There's broth on the stove. Give him small sips if he can keep it down. Lock the doors and don't let anyone in until we get back." "Anyone at all, but Ma, Uncle Martin." Benjamin's voice cracked. "I know, sweetheart. I know." Alice cupped his face in her hands. "But right now, I need you to be strong. Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded, blinking back tears. He took Weah from a pony's arms with surprising gentleness, cradling the smaller boy against his chest. "You're sure about this?" A pony asked quietly. "Your brother-in-law is a dangerous man. When cornered, men like him do desperate things." Alice checked her revolver one more time, then met his eyes. "Martin used my home to hurt a child. He made me complicit in his evil. He killed that boy's mother and would have let Weah die under my floor." Her voice was hard as iron. "I'm very sure." A pony's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but held grim satisfaction. "Then let's go hunting." They mounted up as the last light died in the west. 3 riders heading into the mountains where the shadows grew long and the air turned cold. Sheriff Davis led, followed by Alice, with a pony bringing up the rear. Behind them, Timber Ridge settled into uneasy darkness. And ahead, in a cabin hidden among the pines, Martin Fairchild was about to learn that some debts could only be paid in blood. The mountain trail narrowed as they climbed higher into the pines. Alice's horse picked its way carefully over exposed roots and loose stone, breath steaming in the cold night air. She could see Sheriff Davis ahead, his rifle resting across his saddle, and behind her she felt more than heard a pony Darkwater's presence. The Cherokee warrior moved through the forest like he was part of it, his horse's hooves finding purchase where Alice wouldn't have thought possible. They'd been riding for almost an hour when a pony raised his hand. The sheriff reined in immediately, and Alice did the same. The forest around them had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of wind through the pine needles, and the creak of leather as the horses shifted their weight. Someone's been through here recently. A pony dismounted in one fluid motion and crouched near the trail. Alice watched as he ran his fingers over the dirt, reading signs she couldn't see. 2 horses heavily loaded, moving fast but not panicked. They passed maybe 2 hours ago, heading north toward the high country. He stood and looked at the sheriff. "They know we're coming," Sheriff Davis cursed under his breath. "How could they know?" "We came straight from your place, Alice. Nobody could have warned them." But a pony was already shaking his head. "Martin Fairchild has been doing this for months. A man doesn't survive that long without being careful. He probably has someone watching the town, maybe even watching your farm." The moment your boy rode out for help, word would have traveled. Alice felt ice settle in her stomach. If Martin knew they were coming, he could be anywhere. Could be waiting in ambush, could be circling back toward Timber Ridge and Benjamin. She thought of her son alone in the house with an injured child, and her hand dropped to the revolver at her hip. He won't go back to town. A pony seemed to read her thoughts. Too many witnesses, too many questions. He'll head for the cabin to collect whatever he can carry, then run for the territorial line. If we push hard, we can catch him before he reaches it. He swung back into the saddle. But we need to move now. They rode faster after that, the horses laboring as the trail grew steeper. Alice's thighs burned from gripping the saddle, and branches whipped at her face in the darkness. She kept her head down and trusted her mare to follow the others. The forest pressed close on both sides, ancient pines that had stood here long before white men came. Long before there were towns or trails or reasons for children to disappear. The cabin appeared suddenly, a dark shape against darker trees. It sat in a small clearing, barely more than a shack with a stone chimney and a sagging porch. No light showed in the windows, but smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. Someone was home. A pony held up his hand again, and they stopped at the tree line. He studied the cabin for a long moment, his eyes moving over every detail. "One horse in the corral," he said quietly. "The other is gone. Either Martin's partner already ran, or one of them is out there somewhere watching us right now." Sheriff Davis pulled his rifle from its scabbard. "I'll go to the front door, announce myself proper. Give him a chance to surrender peacefully. You two circle around back in case he tries to run." It wasn't a suggestion. Alice could see the sheriff was uncomfortable with all of this, with riding into the mountains at night, to confront a man based on the word of a Cherokee tracker. "He won't surrender," a pony said. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. Men like him never do. They'd rather die than face what's waiting in a courtroom. He looked at Alice. "Stay close to me. When the shooting starts, get behind cover and stay there." "I can handle myself," Alice said, but her voice shook slightly. She'd never shot at a person before, had never even pointed her gun at another human being with intent. But she thought of Weyas' raw ankle, of the rope cutting into his flesh, of 3 days spent screaming in the darkness beneath her kitchen floor. They split up. The sheriff approached the cabin from the front, moving slowly and calling out as he went. "Martin Fairchild, this is Sheriff Davis. I need you to come out here with your hands where I can see them." Alice and the pony circled through the trees to the back of the cabin. The rear door was barely visible, half hidden by a lean-to stacked with firewood. The sheriff's voice carried clearly in the still air. "I know you're in there, Martin. I know what you've been doing. Come out peaceful, and nobody has to get hurt." Silence answered him. Then a gunshot cracked through the night, and the sheriff's hat flew off his head. He dove behind a water trough as 2 more shots punched through the wood above him. "So much for peaceful," a pony muttered. He pulled his rifle and moved toward the back door. Alice followed, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Another shot came from the cabin, then another. The sheriff was pinned down, unable to move without exposing himself. A pony reached the back door and tested the handle. Locked. He looked at Alice and gestured for her to stand back, then raised his boot and kicked hard. The door exploded inward with a crash, and a pony went through fast and low. Alice heard shouting, the sound of furniture breaking, then a gunshot so loud it made her ears ring. She went through the door without thinking. The cabin's interior was a chaos of shadows and movement. She saw a pony grappling with someone near the fireplace, 2 bodies locked together and straining. Then she saw Martin. Her brother-in-law stood by the front window, rifle raised and pointed at the sheriff outside. He was thinner than she remembered, his red hair wild and unkempt, his face shadowed with days of stubble. He looked like a stranger. like someone she'd never known at all, Martin. Her voice cut through the noise. He spun toward her, and for a moment, their eyes met. She saw recognition there, then something else. Calculation. He swung the rifle toward her. Alice's hand moved on instinct. The revolver came up and she fired without aiming, without thinking, just pulling the trigger because Martin was pointing a gun at her chest and she wanted to live.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The shot went wide, punching into the wall beside his head. He flinched and stumbled backward, and the sheriff kicked in the front door. Everything happened at once then. The man fighting with a pony broke free and ran for the back door, nearly bowling Alice over. She caught a glimpse of a tall figure with a scar running down his face before he was past her and into the night. A pony started after him, but Martin fired again, the bullet catching a pony high in the shoulder and spinning him around. The Cherokee warrior went down hard. Alice saw blood spreading across his shirt and moved without thinking. She stepped between Martin and a pony, her revolver steady now and pointed directly at her brother-in-law's chest. "Drop it," she said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. "Drop the rifle right now, Martin." He stared at her, and she watched something crumble behind his eyes. "Alice, you don't understand. I had to. The bank was going to take everything. Daniel left me nothing but debts and that worthless piece of land." His voice cracked. $200 per child. That's all it took to keep the wolves from the door. Just a few Cherokee kids that nobody would miss. Nobody would miss? Alice's finger tightened on the trigger. That boy has a mother. Had a mother before you cut her throat. He has an uncle who tracked you for 8 days through rain and cold, because he loved that child enough to never stop looking. Tears burned in her eyes, but her hand stayed steady. You put him under my house, Martin. Under my house where I cook and sleep and try to build a life for my son. You made me part of this. I'm sorry. Martin's face twisted. I never meant for you to find him. I was going to move him that night, but the buyer in Nashville got spooked and disappeared. I needed somewhere to hide him until I could find another buyer. I thought your place was safe. I thought you'd never look. He lowered the rifle slightly. Please, Alice, we're family. We're not family. The words came out cold and final. Family doesn't do what you did. Family doesn't steal children and sell them like cattle. Behind her, she heard a pony groan and shift. Sheriff, take his weapon. Sheriff Davis moved forward cautiously, his own rifle trained on Martin. Put it down, Martin. Slow and easy. Don't make this worse than it already is. For a moment, Martin seemed to consider it. His shoulders sagged and the rifle dipped toward the floor. Then he looked at Alice one more time and something hardened in his face. I'm not going to hang, he said quietly. And he raised the rifle again. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Alice's revolver bucked in her hand, and the sheriff's rifle cracked beside her. Martin jerked backward, his rifle clattering to the floor. He hit the wall and slid down slowly, leaving a dark smear on the wood. His eyes were wide and surprised, like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Alice stood frozen, the revolver still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. She'd shot him. She'd actually shot him. The man who'd been married to Daniel's sister, who'd sat at her table and eaten her food, who'd helped Benjamin learn to ride when he was small. She'd put a bullet in his chest and watched him fall. Alice. The sheriff's hand was on her arm, gently lowering the gun. It's over. He's gone. She looked down at Martin's body, at the blood spreading across his shirt, and felt nothing. No grief, no regret, just a hollow emptiness where something important used to be. Behind her, a pony pushed himself to his feet with a grunt of pain. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood soaking through his shirt and dripping onto the floor. The other one, he said through gritted teeth. The one with the scar. We need to go after him. You're not going anywhere except to a doctor. Alice holstered her revolver and moved to support him. Up close, she could see how pale he was, how his jaw was clenched against the pain. That bullet needs to come out and the wound needs to be cleaned. The other man will have to wait. He won't wait. A pony tried to pull away but stumbled. Alice caught him and held on. He'll disappear into the territories and more children will die. I can't let that happen. I won't. You'll die if you try to track him now. She met his eyes, saw the determination there and the pain he was trying to hide. Wayan needs you alive more than he needs revenge. Let it go for tonight. The words seemed to take the last of his strength. A pony's knees buckled, and Alice barely managed to lower him to the floor before he collapsed completely. Sheriff Davis was searching the cabin, pulling open drawers and checking under the bed. He found a leather satchel hidden beneath the floorboards and opened it. His face went gray in the lamplight. Jesus Christ, he breathed. Alice looked over his shoulder and saw what he'd found. Money. Stacks of bills bound with string. More cash than she'd ever seen in one place. And underneath the money, something worse. A ledger. The sheriff opened it with shaking hands and began to read. His lips moved silently as his eyes scanned the pages. Finally he looked up at Alice, and she'd never seen him look so old. There are names here, dates, amounts paid. Martin and his partner didn't just take 3 children. They took 11 over the past 6 months. His voice cracked. 11 Cherokee children stolen from their families and sold. And only Waya survived. Alice felt her legs go weak. She sank down beside a pony, her back against the wall, and tried to process what the sheriff was saying. 11 children. 11 families destroyed. And she'd never suspected, never imagined that the smiling man who called her sister could be capable of such evil. We need to get word to the Cherokee settlements, the sheriff was saying. Let them know what happened here. Let them know we found the ledger and will use it to track down every person involved in this. He looked at Martin's body, then away. And we need to figure out what to do about the money. There's almost $3,000 here. Blood money. Give it to the families. A pony's voice was weak but steady. Use it to help them bury their dead and try to rebuild what was taken from them. It won't bring the children back, but it's something. He looked at Alice. Your brother-in-law is dead. His partner will be caught eventually. Men like him always make mistakes. But the families need to know that someone cared enough to stop this. Alice nodded slowly. She could hear the wind outside, moving through the pines with a sound like distant voices. 11 children. She thought of Waya, of how close he'd come to being just another name in that ledger. How close she'd come to never hearing the scratching beneath her floor. We should head back, Sheriff Davis said. Get a pony to the doctor and figure out what comes next. He started to close the ledger, but Alice stopped him. Wait, let me see that. She took the book and flipped through the pages, reading the careful notations in Martin's handwriting. Dates, locations, prices paid. And at the back, a list of names. Men who'd bought the children, where they'd been shipped, what they'd paid. One name jumped out at her. Charles Whitmore, Nashville. Paid $200 for a girl aged 7, delivered June 12th, and an address. Alice memorized it, committing every detail to memory. If the law wouldn't hunt these men down, she'd find another way. They made a stretcher for a pony from pine branches and a blanket they found in the cabin. The sheriff insisted on wrapping Martin's body as well, though Alice wanted to leave him where he fell. He deserves to rot here, she said, but the sheriff shook his head. He gets a burial, same as any man. That's the law. So they wrapped him and tied him across his horse's back. The ride down the mountain took twice as long as the ride up. A pony drifted in and out of consciousness, and they had to stop every half hour to check his wound and make sure the bleeding hadn't started again. Alice rode beside the stretcher. one hand resting on a pony's good shoulder, willing him to hold on. Dawn was breaking over the valley when they finally reached Timber Ridge. The town was just waking up. Smoke beginning to rise from chimneys and doors opening as people stepped out to start their day. They stopped at the doctor's house first, a small white building at the end of Main Street. Doc Henderson came to the door in his nightshirt, took one look at a pony, and started barking orders. "Get him inside." "Alice, I need hot water and clean bandages." "Sheriff, help me get him on the table." They worked quickly, and within minutes a pony was stretched out on the examination table with the doctor probing his wound. "Bullet's still in there," Doc Henderson muttered. "Lodged against the shoulder blade. Going to be tricky getting it out without doing more damage." He looked at Alice. "This is going to take a while, and it won't be pretty. You might want to wait outside." But Alice shook her head. "I'm staying." The doctor shrugged and went to work. Alice held a pony's hand as Doc Henderson cut away the bloody shirt and began cleaning the wound. The Cherokee warrior's jaw was clenched so tight she thought his teeth might crack, but he didn't make a sound. She watched as the doctor inserted a probe, searching for the bullet, and saw a pony's back arch off the table. "Got it." Doc Henderson's forceps came out gripping a flattened piece of lead. He dropped it in a metal pan with a clink and began stitching the wound closed. "You're lucky. Another inch to the right and it would have clipped your lung. Another inch down and it would have shattered your collarbone. As it is, you'll live, but that arm's going to be stiff for a while." A pony's eyes opened and found Alice's face. "Weah," he said hoarsely. "Is he safe?" "He's safe. Benjamin's watching over him at my place." She squeezed his hand. "Rest now. You've done enough," but a pony was already trying to sit up. "The man with the scar. Did the sheriff send anyone after him?" Alice pushed him gently back down. "He'll be caught. The sheriff has his description and knows which direction he ran. There are deputies out looking right now. He won't be caught." A pony's voice was flat with certainty. "He's too smart, too careful. He'll disappear into the territories and start again somewhere else. Unless someone goes after him now today, while the trail is still fresh." He looked at the doctor. "How soon can I ride?" "You can't." Doc Henderson finished the last stitch and tied it off. "Not for at least a week, maybe 2. That shoulder needs time to heal, or you'll tear it open again and bleed out." He cleaned his instruments and washed his hands. "I'm serious about this. You try to ride now and you'll kill yourself." Alice saw the frustration on the pony's face, the helpless rage of a warrior forced to stop when everything in him demanded action. She knew that feeling. She'd felt it herself when Daniel died, when the world kept turning and expected her to keep turning with it even though everything inside her had stopped. "I'll go." The words were out before she'd fully formed the thought. Both men stared at her. "What?" a pony said. "I'll track him. I can ride, and I'm a decent shot. The sheriff can give me a deputy's badge and a description of the man. I'll find him and bring him back." She looked at a pony. "You saved Weah. Let me finish what you started." "Absolutely not." The sheriff had come back into the room and caught the last part. "Alice, you're not a lawman. You're a farmer's widow with a son to raise. You can't just ride off into the wilderness after a dangerous criminal. It's not your responsibility. Then whose responsibility is it?" Alice's voice rose. "Yours? You've got 3 deputies and a town to protect. You can't spare the men or the time to track one killer across the territories. A pony's? He can barely sit up without passing out. So tell me, Sheriff, whose responsibility is it to make sure that man doesn't steal another child?" The sheriff had no answer. He looked at a pony as if hoping the Cherokee warrior would talk some sense into her. But a pony was watching Alice with an expression she couldn't quite read. Finally he spoke. "Can you track?" Alice hesitated. "Daniel taught me some. I can follow a trail if it's clear." Can you survive alone in the wilderness for days or weeks? I've done it before. When Daniel and I first homesteaded, we spent months with no one around for miles. Can you kill a man? The question hung in the air between them. Alice thought of Martin falling, of the blood on the cabin wall, of the hollow feeling inside her chest where guilt should have been. Yes, she said quietly. I can kill a man. Pony was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. All right. But you don't go alone. Take my horse. He knows the trails and he'll get you through country that would kill most riders. And take this. He reached for his knife, wincing at the movement, and held it out to her. It was my father's. It saved my life more times than I can count. Maybe it will save yours. Alice took the knife, feeling the weight of it in her hand. The handle was worn smooth from use, and the blade gleamed in the lamplight. Thank you, she said. I'll bring it back. And I'll bring that man back with it. She turned to leave, but Pony's voice stopped her. Alice. She looked back. The man with the scar, his name is Clayton Birch. He's fast with a gun, and he doesn't hesitate. If you find him, don't try to take him alive. He'll kill you the moment you give him a chance. His honey-colored eyes were hard. Promise me you understand that. I understand. Alice met his gaze steadily. I'm not looking to be a hero. I'm looking to make sure no more children end up like Weah. She touched the knife at her belt. I'll do whatever it takes outside. The sun was fully up now, and the town was coming to life. Alice walked back to her farm, her mind already working through what she'd need for the journey. Food, water, ammunition, warm clothes for the high country. She'd leave Benjamin with Sheriff Davis's wife, a kind woman who'd lost her own son years ago and would welcome the company. When she reached the house, Benjamin was sitting on the porch with Weah curled up beside him. The Cherokee boy was awake now, his dark eyes following Alice as she approached. Benjamin stood up, his face tight with worry. Ma, where's Uncle Martin? Alice sat down on the porch steps and pulled her son close. He's dead, Benjamin. He tried to kill Sheriff Davis and he tried to kill me, and we had to stop him. She felt the boy stiffen against her. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know he was family. But what he did, stealing those children, it was evil. Pure evil. Benjamin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, good. Alice pulled back to look at him. What? I said good. Benjamin's young face was hard, older than it should have been. After what he did to Weah, after what you told me about the other children, I'm glad he's dead. Does that make me bad? No. Alice cupped his face in her hands. It makes you human. Sometimes good people have to do hard things to stop evil people. That's just how the world works. She took a deep breath. I need to go away for a while. A few days, maybe a week. Uncle Martin had a partner, and someone needs to track him down before he hurts anyone else. You're going after him. It wasn't a question. Benjamin had his father's eyes, and right now they saw right through her. Let me come with you. I can shoot, I can ride, I can help. No. Alice's voice was firm. You're staying here with Mrs. Davis. Weah needs someone to watch over him while his uncle heals, and I need to know you're safe. She stood up. I'm trusting you to be the man of the house while I'm gone. Can you do that? Benjamin nodded reluctantly. Alice went inside and started gathering supplies. As she worked, she felt Weah watching her from the doorway. The boy said something in Cherokee, his voice still hoarse from 3 days of screaming. Alice wished she could understand him, wished she could tell him that she was going to finish this, that the man who'd taken him would never hurt another child. She finished packing and stepped back onto the porch. The sun was climbing higher now, and she could feel the day warming around her. It was going to be a beautiful autumn day, the kind of day that made you grateful to be alive. Alice looked at her son, at the farm she'd built with Daniel, at the mountains rising in the distance. Then she swung into a pony's saddle and turned the horse north. Behind her, Benjamin called out, "Ma, be careful." Alice raised her hand in farewell but didn't look back. If she looked back, she might not go. And someone had to go. Someone had to finish this. The trail led up into the high country, toward the territorial line and the wild lands beyond. Alice followed it as the sun climbed higher and Timber Ridge disappeared behind her. She had a name. She had a knife. And she had a promise to keep. The trail grew harder to follow as Alice pushed deeper into the wilderness. Clayton Birch knew what he was doing. He'd crossed streams to hide his tracks, doubled back on his own path, left false trails that led nowhere. But a pony's horse seemed to sense things Alice couldn't see. The animal would pause at certain spots, nostrils flaring, then veer off in a direction that always picked up the trail again. She'd been riding for 2 days now, sleeping in her saddle when exhaustion forced her to stop, eating cold jerky and hardtack because she didn't dare light a fire. The high country was unforgiving. At night, temperatures dropped below freezing, and she'd wake shivering despite her heavy coat and blankets. During the day, the sun burned bright and merciless, reflecting off patches of early snow until her eyes ached. On the morning of the 3rd day, she found the first real sign. A campsite, maybe 8 hours old, tucked into a rocky outcrop that provided shelter from the wind. The fire had been carefully banked and covered, but Alice could still feel warmth in the ashes when she pressed her hand against them. Whoever had camped here knew how to move through the wilderness without leaving obvious traces. She searched the area carefully, the way Daniel had taught her years ago. Most people looked for big signs, obvious tracks and broken branches. But the real story was in the small details. A bent blade of grass that hadn't sprung back yet. A stone turned over to reveal damp earth underneath. Scratches on a tree trunk where someone had leaned their rifle. Alice found something better. A button, small and made of horn, lying half buried in the dirt near where the fire had been. She picked it up and turned it over in her fingers. It was old, worn smooth by years of use, and one edge was chipped. The kind of button that might fall off a shirt that had seen too many repairs. She slipped it into her pocket and kept searching. 20 yards from the campsite, she found where Clayton had relieved himself. The spot was still damp, which meant he couldn't be more than a few hours ahead. Alice's pulse quickened. She was closing the distance. Another day, maybe 2, and she'd catch him. She rode harder after that, pushing a pony's horse faster than she should have. The animal responded without complaint, its powerful legs eating up the miles with a ground-covering lope that would have exhausted a lesser mount. Alice could feel the horse's strength beneath her, the intelligence in the way it picked its path through the rocky terrain. By mid-afternoon, she spotted something that made her rein in sharply. Smoke, just a thin tendril rising above the trees about a mile ahead. Alice dismounted and led the horse into a thick stand of pine, tying it where it couldn't be seen from the trail. She checked her revolver, made sure a pony's knife was secure at her belt, and started forward on foot. The smoke led her to a small valley she hadn't known existed. A creek ran through the bottom, and beside it sat a rough cabin that looked like it had been abandoned for years. But the smoke was coming from its chimney, and a horse was tied to a rail out front. Not Clayton's horse, though. This one was a gray mare, older and heavier than the mount he'd been riding. Alice circled wide, using the trees for cover, trying to get a better view. Through a gap in the pines, she saw the cabin's door open and a woman step out. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a braid. She carried a bucket and walked toward the creek with the easy stride of someone who belonged here. Alice watched as the woman knelt by the water and began filling the bucket. She was humming something, a tune Alice didn't recognize. There was no fear in her movements, no wariness. Whoever she wasn't afraid of being alone in this isolated place. A man's voice called out from inside the cabin, too distant for Alice to make out the words. The woman answered and picked up the full bucket, carrying it back toward the building. As she passed through a shaft of sunlight, Alice saw her face clearly. She was smiling. Something was wrong. This didn't feel like a hostage situation. The woman moved too freely, too comfortably. Alice waited, watching the cabin, trying to understand what she was seeing. Was this Clayton's woman? A partner he'd come to for help? Or something else entirely? The decision was made for her when the cabin door opened again and Clayton Birch himself stepped out. Even at this distance, Alice recognized him from a pony's description. Tall, lean, with a jagged scar running from his left temple down to his jaw. He stretched in the sunlight, rolled his shoulders, then walked over to check on his horse. The gray Mari must have belonged to the woman. Alice's hand moved to her revolver. She could shoot him from here. The distance was maybe 60 yards, well within her range if she braced the gun properly. One shot and this would be over. She could bring his body back to Timber Ridge, collect whatever reward the sheriff was offering, and go home to Benjamin. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way Clayton moved, careful and alert, even in what should have been a safe place. Maybe it was the woman, who clearly had no idea what kind of man she was harboring. Or maybe it was just Alice's need to understand why. Why steal children? Why destroy families? What kind of darkness lived inside a person that let them do such things? She waited until Clayton went back inside, then circled around to approach the cabin from the blind side. There was one window on this wall, positioned high enough that she'd need to stand on something to see through it. Alice found an old stump and dragged it quietly into position, then climbed up and peered inside. The cabin's interior was surprisingly homey. A fire burned in the stone hearth, and the woman was cooking something in a pot that smelled of venison and wild onions. Clayton sat at a rough table, cleaning his rifle with methodical care. They were talking, but Alice couldn't hear the words through the thick log walls. She watched for several minutes, learning the layout of the space. One room, no back door, a ladder leading up to a sleeping loft. The woman's rifle leaned against the wall near the hearth, too far from Clayton to be useful if things went wrong. Alice's mind worked through possibilities. She could wait until dark, when they'd be blinded by the firelight, and she'd have the advantage. Or she could kick in the door right now and take them by surprise. The woman laughed at something Clayton said, and the sound carried through the window. It was genuine, full of warmth. Alice felt her stomach twist. This woman had no idea she was laughing with a child killer, sharing her home with someone who'd murdered Waya's mother and left a boy to die beneath a stranger's floor. Alice climbed down from the stump and moved around to the front of the cabin. She drew her revolver, checked the cylinder one more time, and took a deep breath. Then she kicked the door open and stepped inside. The woman screamed. Clayton was up and moving before the door finished bouncing off its hinges, his hand reaching for the pistol at his hip. But Alice was faster. Don't. Her revolver was trained on his chest, steady as stone. Pull that gun, and I'll put a bullet through your heart before it clears the leather. Clayton froze, his hand hovering over the pistol. His eyes met Alice's, and she saw recognition there. He knew who she was, or at least he knew she'd come from Timber Ridge. "You must be Martin's sister-in-law," he said calmly. "Alice, right? He talked about you. Said you were stubborn. Hands up." Nice and slow. Alice kept the gun trained on him as he raised his hands. "Now unbuckle that gun belt and let it drop." Clayton complied, moving carefully. The belt hit the floor with a thud. "Good. Now step away from it." The woman had backed herself into a corner, her hands pressed against her mouth. "Sarah, it's all right," Clayton said without taking his eyes off Alice. "This is just a misunderstanding. I'm sure we can work it out." Sarah, so that was the woman's name. Alice looked at her briefly. "You know what he is? What he's done?" Sarah shook her head, eyes wide with terror. "He's a kidnapper," Alice said flatly. He and my brother-in-law have been stealing Cherokee children and selling them. At least 11 kids over the past 6 months. Most of them died in transit or were worked to death wherever they ended up. One boy survived long enough for us to find him tied up like an animal beneath my kitchen floor. Sarah's face went white. No, that's not possible. Clayton, tell her that's not true. But Clayton said nothing. His scarred face might have been carved from stone. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and Alice saw the moment understanding dawned. "Oh God," Sarah whispered. "Oh God, you did it."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
All those times you went away for days, came back with money. I thought you were hunting or trapping or working as a guide, but you were. Sarah, listen to me. Clayton's voice was urgent now. It's not what you think. Those children, they weren't like us. They were Cherokee. Nobody cares what happens to them. The government's been moving them west anyway, cramming them onto reservations where half of them die from disease or starvation. I just helped speed up the process and made a little money doing it. The slap echoed through the cabin. Sarah's hand had moved so fast Alice almost missed it. Clayton's head snapped to the side and a red mark bloomed on his cheek. "Get out," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Get out of my house. Get out of my life. I never want to see you again." "Sarah, be reasonable," Clayton started, but she cut him off. "Reasonable? You murdered children. You stood in my home, ate my food, shared my bed, and you murdered children." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "I loved you. I thought you were a good man. How could you do this?" Alice saw Clayton's expression change. The calm mask slipped, and underneath was something cold and calculating. "I did it for us," he said. "For you. That money was going to buy us a place out west, away from all this. A real ranch, not some falling down cabin in the middle of nowhere. I did it so we could have a better life. I don't want a life bought with dead children's blood." Sarah's voice rose to a scream. "I don't want anything from you. Get out." Clayton's jaw tightened. "I can't do that, Sarah. You know too much now. You heard what she said." He glanced at Alice. "If I leave, you'll tell the law everything. I can't let that happen." Alice saw his weight shift, saw his muscles coil. She fired without hesitation. The bullet caught Clayton in the thigh and spun him around. He went down hard, clutching his leg and cursing. Alice moved forward quickly, kicked his pistol away, and pressed the barrel of her revolver against the back of his head. "Don't move," she said quietly. "I will kill you. I've already killed your partner, and I will not lose a minute's sleep over adding you to the count." She looked at Sarah. "You have rope?" Sarah nodded mutely, still pressed against the wall. "Get it. We're going to tie him up." It took 20 minutes to secure Clayton properly. Alice used every knot Daniel had taught her, plus a few she invented on the spot. By the time she was finished, Clayton was trussed like a Christmas goose, unable to move more than a few inches in any direction. The bullet wound in his thigh was bleeding steadily, but not dangerously. He'd live long enough to hang. Sarah had collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands. She was crying silently, her shoulders shaking. Alice felt a stab of sympathy for the woman. However this played out, Sarah's life was ruined. The man she'd loved was a monster, and everyone in the territory would know she'd harbored him. "You didn't know," Alice said quietly. "Nobody's going to blame you for that." Sarah looked up, her face blotchy with tears. "How could I not know? How could I live with him for months and never suspect?" She wiped her eyes roughly. "What kind of person does that make me, human?" Alice pulled up another chair and sat down. "Monsters don't advertise what they are. They smile and act normal and make you believe they're good people. That's how they survive." She looked at Clayton, who was watching them both with cold eyes. You couldn't have known because he didn't want you to know. I should have seen something, Sarah insisted. Some sign, some hint. But he was always so kind to me, so gentle. He brought me flowers and told me stories and made me laugh. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. How can someone be gentle with the woman they love and still murder children? Alice had no answer for that. She'd been asking herself the same question about Martin ever since she'd found Weah under her floor. How could he joke with Benjamin about fishing while planning to kidnap another child? How could he eat her cornbread and compliment her cooking while a boy starved in the darkness beneath her feet? People are complicated, she said finally. They can hold contradictions inside themselves that don't make sense to anyone else. Maybe he really did love you. Maybe that was real. But so was the evil he did, and the evil matters more. Clayton laughed, a harsh sound that made both women turn toward him. You two going to sit there philosophizing all day? Or are you going to deal with the fact that Alice here just shot an unarmed man in cold blood? He looked at Alice. That's what the law will see. I wasn't threatening you. I didn't have a weapon in my hand. You gunned me down like a dog. You were reaching for your gun, Alice said coldly. I saw it, did you? Or did you just want an excuse to shoot me? Clayton's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile. See, the problem with vigilante justice is it tends to look a lot like murder when you get it in front of a judge. Especially when the vigilante is a woman and the victim is a white man. Alice felt ice in her stomach because she knew he was right. Even with the ledger, even with Weah's testimony and a pony's word, the courts might not see this her way. She was a woman who'd ridden alone into the wilderness to hunt a man. Who'd shot him in someone else's home while he was unarmed. A good lawyer could spin that into something ugly. Then I guess I'll have to make sure you don't get in front of a judge, she said quietly. Clayton's smile faded. What? You heard me. Alice stood up and checked her revolver. I came here to stop you from hurting more children. That's what I'm going to do. Alice, no. Sarah was on her feet, her hand reaching out. You can't just execute him. That's murder. That's exactly what he did to those children's families. You can't become the same thing you're trying to stop. I'm not the same. Alice met the woman's eyes. I'm not doing this for money or because I enjoy it. I'm doing it because if I bring him back alive, there's a chance he walks free. A chance he finds another partner and starts over somewhere else. I can't let that happen. Then testify, Sarah pleaded. Tell them what he did. Make them listen. They won't listen. Alice's voice was tired. I'm a woman with no education and no standing. He's a white man with money from his crimes to pay for lawyers. Who do you think they'll believe? She looked at Clayton. I'm sorry it has to be this way. But I made a promise to a little boy who spent 3 days dying under my floor. I promised I'd finish this. Clayton wasn't smiling anymore. You won't do it. You're not a killer. You shot Martin because you had to, because he was pointing a gun at you. But this is different. You'd have to look me in the eyes and pull that trigger knowing I'm helpless. Knowing it's cold-blooded murder. You can't do that. Alice raised the revolver and cocked the hammer. The click was loud in the quiet cabin. You're wrong, she said softly. I can do it. I have to do it. Because if I don't, more children die. And I won't have that on my conscience. For a long moment, nobody moved. Alice stood with the gun trained on Clayton's head, her finger on the trigger. Sarah stood frozen, one hand still reaching out. Clayton stared up at Alice, and for the first time she saw real fear in his eyes. Then Alice lowered the gun. But you're right about one thing. I'm not like you. I don't kill helpless people. She uncocked the revolver and holstered it. Sarah, do you have a wagon? Sarah blinked, confused by the sudden shift. What? A wagon? Or a horse I can borrow? I need to get him back to Timber Ridge so he can stand trial. You're making a mistake, Clayton said. "I will walk free. I've got money hidden where nobody will find it, enough to buy the best lawyers in the territory. You're handing me my freedom on a silver platter, maybe." Alice began checking his bonds, making sure they were still secure. "But at least I'll be able to sleep at night. At least I'll know I did this the right way." She looked at Sarah. "I'll need your help getting him into a wagon. And I'll need you to ride with me back to Timber Ridge to testify about what he told you." Sarah nodded slowly. "I have a wagon. It's old, but it works. And I'll testify. I'll tell them everything he said." She looked at Clayton with something like hatred. Every single word. It took an hour to get Clayton loaded into the wagon and secured properly. Alice used every piece of rope Sarah had, plus strips torn from an old blanket, making absolutely sure he couldn't escape or throw himself out while they traveled. His leg wound had stopped bleeding, and Sarah packed it with clean cloth to keep infection out. They set out in the early afternoon, Sarah driving the wagon with Clayton in the back, Alice riding alongside on a pony's horse. The trail down from the mountains was treacherous, forcing them to move slowly and carefully. Several times they had to stop and clear fallen branches or navigate around washouts from the autumn rains. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Alice found herself thinking about Weah. Was he recovering? Had his wounds begun to heal? Did he have nightmares about the darkness and the rope around his ankle? She hoped Benjamin was taking good care of him, hoped the boy was learning to smile again. "You did the right thing," Sarah said quietly. She'd been silent for hours, lost in her own thoughts. Back at the cabin, "I thought you were going to kill him, and part of me wanted you to. But you didn't. You chose the harder path, maybe." Alice looked back at Clayton, who sat in the wagon bed with his head down. "Or maybe I just couldn't pull the trigger. Maybe I'm not as strong as I thought I was. Strength isn't about killing," Sarah said. "My grandmother used to say that any fool can destroy something. It takes real strength to build, to create, to choose mercy when vengeance would be easier." She looked at Alice. "You chose mercy. That's strength." They made camp that night in a sheltered hollow, taking turns keeping watch over Clayton. He didn't speak, didn't eat when they offered him food, just sat with his back against a tree and stared into the darkness. Alice wondered what he was thinking. Was he planning an escape? Or had he already accepted that his life was over? On the morning of the fourth day, they crested the final ridge and saw Timber Ridge spread out in the valley below. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys, and Alice could see people moving in the streets, going about their daily business. It looked peaceful, ordinary, like a place where nothing bad ever happened, but Alice knew better now. She knew that evil could hide behind a friendly smile, that monsters could live among normal people and nobody would suspect. She knew that the world was darker and more complicated than she'd ever imagined. But she also knew that people like a pony and Sarah existed. People who chose to do the right thing even when it was hard. People who fought against the darkness. They rode into town at midday, and word of their arrival spread quickly. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, a crowd had gathered. Alice saw Sheriff Davis emerge, his face lighting up with relief when he spotted her. Behind him came a pony, his arm in a sling but moving under his own power. And beside a pony, holding his hand, was Weah. The boy's eyes went wide when he saw Clayton in the wagon. He said something in Cherokee, his voice high and frightened. A pony knelt beside him, murmuring reassurances, but his eyes never left Clayton's face. Alice saw the rage there, the barely controlled violence, and for a moment she thought a pony might tear Clayton apart with his bare hands. "Is he the one?" Sheriff Davis asked quietly. A pony nodded once, sharp and certain. The sheriff turned to Clayton. "Clayton Birch, you're under arrest for kidnapping, murder, and conspiracy to commit multiple felonies. You'll be held in my jail until the circuit judge arrives." He looked at his deputies. Get him down from there and locked up. Double chains on this one. As they hauled Clayton away, he looked back at Alice one last time. This isn't over, he called out. You think you've won, but you haven't. I'll find a way out of this. I always do. Alice watched him disappear into the sheriff's office. Then dismounted and walked over to where a pony stood with Weah. The boy looked up at her with those huge dark eyes. And she saw something in them she hadn't seen before. Recognition, understanding. He said something in Cherokee, and a pony translated. He says thank you. He says you're brave like the old warriors in the stories his mother used to tell. Alice knelt down so she was at eye level with Weah. Tell him I'm sorry I couldn't save his mother. Tell him I'm sorry he had to suffer for so long. A pony spoke to the boy in Cherokee, and Weah responded at length. He says it's not your fault. He says his mother would be grateful that you saved him. He says she's with the ancestors now, watching over him, and she's proud of what you did. Alice felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of everyone. She stood up and found a pony watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You brought him back alive, he said. I wasn't sure you would. I thought about killing him, Alice admitted. God help me, I wanted to. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't become what he is. That's what makes you different. A pony placed his good hand on her shoulder. That's what makes you better. He looked toward the sheriff's office. The trial will be hard. Clayton has money and connections. But with Sarah's testimony and the ledger and Weah's story, we have a chance. A real chance at justice, Alice nodded, suddenly exhausted. She'd been running on determination and rage for days, and now that it was over, she felt like she might collapse. I need to see Benjamin, she said. I need to go home. He's at my house, a pony said. Mrs. Davis has been taking care of both boys. They've become friends, I think. Despite everything, or maybe because of it. He smiled slightly. Come, I'll walk you there. As they walked through the streets of Timber Ridge, people stopped and stared. By tomorrow, Alice knew, her story would be all over town. The widow who'd ridden into the wilderness to hunt a child killer. Some would call her brave. Others would call her foolish, or unwomanly, or worse. But Alice found she didn't care what they thought. She'd done what needed to be done. She'd kept her promise to Weah, and she'd proven to herself that even in the darkest moments, even when every instinct screamed for vengeance, it was possible to choose a better path. That had to be enough. The trial began 3 weeks later under a sky heavy with the promise of winter's first snow. The circuit judge, a stern man named Thaddeus Holbrook, arrived with his clerk and an air of profound skepticism about the whole affair. Alice watched from the front row of the makeshift courtroom as Clayton Birch was led in, chains rattling with each step. He'd been given time to clean up, and his lawyer had provided him with a proper suit. He looked almost respectable. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls, more crowding outside the windows trying to hear. Alice had never seen Timber Ridge so united in purpose. Cherokee families had traveled from settlements across the territory, wanting to bear witness. A pony sat beside her, Weah on his other side. The boy had nightmares still, waking screaming most nights, but a pony said being here would help. Facing the monster that had hurt him might take away some of its power. Clayton's lawyer was a silver-haired man from Denver named Cornelius Wade. He wore expensive clothes and carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case. He cared about winning. He spent the first hour of the trial establishing Clayton's character, calling witnesses who testified to his honesty, his work ethic, his kindness to animals and old women. Alice listened and felt sick. Then it was the prosecution's turn. The prosecutor was young, barely 30, appointed by the territorial governor specifically for this case. His name was James Chun, and his family had come from China 2 generations ago. He understood what it meant to be viewed as less than human by men like Clayton Birch. He stood and called his first witness. The prosecution calls Weah Darkwater to the stand. The courtroom went silent. A pony stood, helping Weah to his feet. The boy walked forward on legs that trembled, his hand clutching his uncle's for support. Judge Holbrook looked down at him with something that might have been pity. "This boy doesn't speak English," Cornelius Wade objected immediately. "How can he testify? His uncle will translate," James Chun said smoothly. "And we have independent verification of his story from multiple sources." Wade sat down, but Alice could see him making notes. He'd find a way to attack Weah's credibility. That's what lawyers like him did. Weah told his story in Cherokee, his voice small but steady. A pony translated, his own voice rough with emotion he was trying to hide. The boy described how two men had broken into his mother's home at night. How he'd woken to find his mother on the floor, blood pooling beneath her. How the tall man with the scar had grabbed him and tied his hands. How they'd ridden for days, Weah thrown over a horse like a sack of grain, until they reached Martin Fairchild's farm. "And can you identify the man with the scar?" James Chun asked gently. Weah pointed directly at Clayton Birch. "That one. He's the one who killed my mother." The courtroom erupted. Judge Holbrook's gavel came down hard. "Order. I will have order." He glared at the crowd until silence fell again. Cornelius Wade stood for cross-examination. "Young man, it was dark that night, wasn't it? And you were terrified. Are you absolutely certain it was my client you saw?" Weah looked at the lawyer for a long moment. Then he pulled up his sleeve, revealing a scar on his forearm. "He did this," he said through a pony's translation. "When I tried to fight him, he said if I didn't stop struggling, he'd cut my throat like he cut my mother's. I remember his voice. I remember his face. It's him." Wade tried several more angles, but Weah wouldn't be shaken. Finally the lawyer sat down, his expression grim. James Chun called Sarah Matthews next. She walked to the stand with her head high, though Alice could see her hands shaking. She told the court about Clayton, about their relationship, about the day Alice had arrived at her cabin. And what did the defendant say when confronted with these accusations? Chun asked. Sarah's voice was clear and steady. "He said the children weren't like us. He said nobody cared what happened to Cherokee people. He said he was just speeding up what the government was already doing and making money from it." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Those were his exact words. Wade tore into Sarah on cross-examination, painting her as a scorned woman seeking revenge on a former lover. But Sarah held firm, repeating again and again what Clayton had said, never wavering in her testimony. When she finally stepped down, Alice saw tears on her face, but her head was still high. The prosecution called witness after witness. Cherokee families who'd lost children. Settlers who'd seen Clayton and Martin together. A banker from Nashville who testified about large cash deposits Clayton had made over the past year. And finally, James Chun called Alice to the stand. She'd been dreading this moment. Walking to the witness box felt like walking through deep water, each step harder than the last. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then sat and looked out at the sea of faces. Benjamin was there, sitting with Mrs. Davis. He gave her a small nod of encouragement. James Chun took her through the events methodically. Finding Weah under her floor. A pony's arrival. The confrontation at Martin's cabin. The hunt for Clayton. She told it all in a voice that sounded strange to her own ears, flat and emotionless. Like she was describing something that had happened to someone else. Then Cornelius Wade stood up for cross-examination. And Alice knew the real battle was about to begin. "Mrs. Fairchild, you shot and killed your brother-in-law, Martin Fairchild. Is that correct?" "Yes, and you pursued my client into the wilderness with the intent to kill him as well. Isn't that true?" "No." Alice met Wade's eyes directly. "I pursued him with the intent to stop him from hurting more children. I would have killed him if necessary, but I brought him back alive for trial. But you did shoot him. In the leg. While he was unarmed in a private residence. That's assault with a deadly weapon, Mrs. Fairchild. He was reaching for his gun, Alice said firmly. I saw him move toward it. I fired to stop him from shooting me or Sarah Matthews. Wade smiled, and Alice's stomach sank. Interesting. Because Miss Matthews's testimony makes no mention of my client reaching for a weapon. In fact, she testified that you pulled your gun first and gave him no chance to defend himself. Alice's mind raced. Had Sarah said that? She tried to remember the exact words, but everything from that day was a blur of adrenaline and fear. He was dangerous, she said finally. He'd already killed at least one person that we knew of. I wasn't going to give him the chance to kill again, so you took justice into your own hands. Wade's voice was sharp now, cutting. You decided this man was guilty and hunted him down like an animal. You shot him without due process, without a trial, without any legal authority whatsoever. And now you want this court to validate your vigilante actions by convicting him based on evidence you gathered through illegal means. Objection. James Chun was on his feet. The witness was acting in the defense of others and in pursuit of a wanted criminal. There's precedent for citizens' arrests throughout the territories. Citizen's arrest requires that the citizen witness the crime, Wade shot back. Mrs. Fairchild witnessed nothing. She acted on suspicion and hearsay. Judge Holbrook held up his hand. Gentlemen, that's enough. The objection is sustained. Mr. Wade, confine your questions to the facts of the case. But Alice could see the damage was done. Wade had planted doubt in the judge's mind about her credibility, about whether her testimony could be trusted. The trial continued for 2 more days. The prosecution presented the ledger Martin had kept, with its damning list of names and dates and prices. They called a doctor who testified about Weah's injuries, the rope burns on his ankle that would scar him for life. They called Cherokee elders who spoke about the children who disappeared, the families destroyed. Each piece of evidence built on the last, creating a picture of systematic cruelty that should have been impossible to deny. But Cornelius Wade was good at his job. He cast doubt on the ledger's authenticity, suggesting Martin could have fabricated it to implicate Clayton if he was ever caught. He questioned the reliability of Cherokee testimony, invoking old prejudices that many in the territory still held. He painted Clayton as a simple man trying to make his way in a hard world, wrongly accused by a vengeful widow and her Indian allies. On the final day, both sides made their closing arguments. Wade spoke for over an hour, his voice rising and falling with practiced emotion. He talked about the presumption of innocence, about how dangerous it was to convict a man based on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a traumatized child. He made it sound like convicting Clayton would be the real crime. Then James Chun stood up. He was quiet at first, almost conversational. He talked about the 11 children named in the ledger, giving each one a history, a family, a life before Clayton Birch stole them away. He described in clinical detail what had been done to Weah, the 3 days spent in darkness with a rope cutting into his flesh. He held up the bloody rope itself, preserved as evidence, and made the jury look at it. Mr. Wade wants you to believe this is about prejudice, Chun said. That we're only pursuing his client because the victims were Cherokee. But I say it's exactly the opposite. For too long, crimes against Cherokee people have been ignored, dismissed, treated as less important than crimes against white settlers. This case isn't about prejudice. It's about finally, giving Cherokee children the same protection under law that white children have always enjoyed. He turned to face Clayton directly. This man stole children. He sold them into slavery. He murdered at least one mother and would have murdered more if he'd been given the chance. The evidence is overwhelming. The testimony is consistent. The only question before you is whether you have the courage to do what's right. Judge Holbrook called for a recess before rendering his verdict. The wait was agonizing. Alice sat outside the courthouse with a pony and Wea, watching storm clouds gather over the mountains. Snow was coming, she could feel it in the air. Winter would be early and hard this year. Whatever happens, you did everything you could, a pony said quietly. No one could have done more. But Alice wasn't sure that was true. Maybe if she'd been smarter, more careful in her testimony. Maybe if she'd found more evidence or brought Clayton back in better condition. Maybe. Stop, a pony said, reading her face. Second-guessing yourself doesn't change anything. We presented the truth. Now we wait to see if the truth matters. The bailiff appeared in the courthouse door. Judge is ready. They filed back inside, taking their seats in the packed courtroom. Alice's heart hammered against her ribs. Everything came down to this moment. Judge Holbrook entered and took his seat behind the bench. His weathered face was unreadable. I've reviewed all the evidence presented in this case, he began. I've considered the testimony of every witness. I've examined the ledger, the physical evidence, and the arguments made by both counsel. He paused, and the silence stretched unbearably long. This is perhaps the most difficult case I've adjudicated in 30 years on the bench. The crimes alleged are heinous. The evidence, while compelling in many respects, is also circumstantial. The primary witness is a child who experienced severe trauma. Under normal circumstances, I might have reasonable doubt. Alice felt her stomach drop. He was going to acquit. After everything, Clayton would walk free. However, Judge Holbrook continued, these are not normal circumstances. The testimony of Wea Darkwater, while given by a child, was consistent, detailed, and unwavering even under aggressive cross-examination. The testimony of Sarah Matthews was credible and damning. The ledger, while potentially subject to falsification, contains details that could only have been known by someone directly involved in these crimes. And most tellingly, the defendant had the opportunity to refute these allegations under oath, and chose not to testify in his own defense. Clayton shifted in his seat. Wade had probably advised him not to take the stand, knowing the prosecutor would tear him apart. But that silence now hung heavy in the courtroom. Furthermore, the judge said, I cannot ignore the pattern of behavior evidenced by the systematic nature of these crimes. This was not a one-time lapse in judgment. This was calculated, ongoing criminal enterprise that targeted the most vulnerable members of our society. Children who had no way to defend themselves, from families who had no recourse under law. His voice hardened. Until now, on the charge of kidnapping, I find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, guilty. On the charge of murder in the death of Avanasa Darkwater, guilty. On the charge of assault with intent to kill in the attack on Mrs. Alice Fairchild, guilty. The gavel came down with each pronouncement. And with each strike, Alice felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. The courtroom erupted. People were cheering, crying, embracing each other. Alice sat frozen, unable to quite believe it was over. Beside her, a pony had his head bowed, one hand covering his face. Wea looked confused by all the noise, but when his uncle pulled him into a fierce embrace, he seemed to understand that something important had happened. Judge Holbrook brought his gavel down repeatedly, finally restoring some semblance of order. The defendant will be remanded to custody pending sentencing. Given the severity of these crimes and the number of victims involved, I'm prepared to impose the maximum penalty allowed under territorial law. He looked directly at Clayton. Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence? Clayton stood slowly. His face was pale but composed, showing none of the emotion roiling through the courtroom. I do, Your Honor. He turned to face the gallery, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Alice. You think you've won. You think justice has been served. But all you've done is prove that your law doesn't apply equally. A white man convicted on the word of Indians and women. He smiled, and it was the coldest thing Alice had ever seen. This verdict won't stand. I'll appeal to the Territorial Supreme Court, and they'll overturn it. Men like me don't hang for crimes against people like them. Sit down. Judge Holbrook's voice cracked like a whip. You've said quite enough. He leaned forward, his weathered face hard as granite. Mr. Birch, I've spent 3 decades watching men like you corrupt the law. Twist it to serve your own ends, hide behind it when it suits you, and ignore it when it doesn't. You're right that justice hasn't always been equally applied. But that changes today, Clayton Birch, for the crimes of kidnapping, conspiracy, murder, and assault. I sentence you to death by hanging. Sentence to be carried out at dawn 3 days from now. May God have mercy on your soul, because I have none. The gavel came down one final time, and it sounded like thunder. They led Clayton away in chains. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the crowd or the families of his victims. He walked out of that courtroom like he was walking to dinner, calm and unconcerned. Alice wondered if he really believed he'd escape justice, or if that certainty was just the last mask he had left to wear. Outside, the first snowflakes were falling. Alice stood on the courthouse steps and tilted her face up to the sky, letting the cold crystals melt on her skin. People swirled around her, talking excitedly, planning celebrations, but she felt strangely empty. It was over. Clayton would hang, and no more children would disappear in the night. But 11 families still grieved. 11 children would never come home. You're thinking about the ones we couldn't save, a pony said, appearing beside her. It wasn't a question. How did you know? Because I'm thinking about them too. My sister. The 10 others whose names we know, and probably dozens more we don't. He was quiet for a moment. But we saved Weah, and we stopped it from happening again. That has to mean something, does it? Alice looked at him. 11 children dead, and we managed to save one. That's not exactly a victory. It is to Weah. A pony glanced back toward the courthouse where the boy was surrounded by Cherokee elders, being hugged and blessed and celebrated. He gets to grow up now. He gets to have a life. Because of what you did, because you heard him crying and you didn't turn away. Alice felt tears on her face, cold against her skin. I should have heard him sooner. I should have known something was wrong the first night. You heard him when it mattered, a pony said again. And you didn't stop there. You rode into the wilderness alone to find the man who hurt him. You risked everything for a child who wasn't even yours. That's not nothing, Alice. That's everything. Benjamin appeared, pushing through the crowd. Ma! He threw his arms around her, and Alice held him tight, breathing in the smell of him, wood smoke and soap and boy. Is it really over? He asked. Is he really going to hang? Yes, Alice said. It's really over. Good. Benjamin pulled back to look at her. I'm glad you didn't kill him in that cabin. I'm glad you let the law do it instead. That makes you different than him. I almost did kill him, Alice admitted. I wanted to so badly. But at the last second, I couldn't pull the trigger. That's what makes you good, Benjamin said simply. Bad people want to kill and they do it. Good people want to kill and they don't. You're good, Ma. Alice hugged her son again, wondering when he'd gotten so wise. Around them, the celebration continued. Cherokee families were singing, the sound rising into the falling snow. Sheriff Davis was accepting congratulations, looking uncomfortable with all the attention. Sarah Matthews stood alone near her wagon, and Alice caught her eye. The woman nodded once, a gesture of mutual respect between two people who'd survived something terrible together. That night, Alice couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Clayton in his cell, counting down his final hours. She wondered if he was afraid, if he regretted what he'd done, if he'd try to make peace with whatever God he believed in. Somehow she doubted it. Men like Clayton didn't change, even facing death. They just got angry that the world finally caught up with them. She got out of bed and walked to the window. The snow was falling harder now, already covering the ground in white. In 3 days, Clayton Birch would hang. Justice would be served, at least in the legal sense. But Weah would still have nightmares. 11 families would still grieve. And Alice would still remember the sound of those small fingers scratching uselessly against the floorboards. Behind her, Benjamin stirred in his sleep, murmuring something she couldn't make out. Alice turned from the window and went to check on him, pulling his blankets up higher against the cold. He looked so young in sleep, so innocent. She thought about what he'd said earlier about good people and bad people. It wasn't that simple, she knew. The world was more complicated than that, but maybe it didn't need to be. Maybe it was enough to know that when faced with evil, she'd done what she could to stop it. She hadn't been perfect, hadn't saved everyone, but she'd saved one boy. And sometimes, in a world as dark as this one, saving one was all you could do. Alice returned to her own bed and finally slept. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering everything in white, making the world look clean and new again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Alice Fairchild slept without nightmares. The hanging took place at dawn on a morning so cold, the executioner's breath formed clouds that hung in the still air. Alice hadn't planned to attend, but Benjamin asked her to go with him. "I need to see it end," he said quietly. "I need to know he's really gone." So they stood in the crowd, near the back, and watched as Clayton Birch was led up the steps to the gallows. He'd refused a hood, refused a priest, refused to make any final statement beyond what he'd said in the courtroom. He stood on the platform and looked out at the assembled crowd with those cold eyes. And even now, even facing death, he showed no remorse. The executioner positioned him over the trapdoor, adjusted the noose around his neck, and stepped back. Sheriff Davis read the death warrant aloud, his voice carrying across the silent square. When he finished, he looked at Clayton one last time. "May God have mercy on your soul." Clayton smiled. "God's got nothing to do with this." Then the trap door opened, and he dropped. Alice turned Benjamin's face against her shoulder, so he wouldn't see the body jerking at the end of the rope. But she watched. She made herself watch until Clayton Birch stopped moving, until the doctor stepped forward and pronounced him dead, until they cut him down and loaded him into a pine box. She watched because Weah's mother couldn't, because the families of 11 stolen children deserved to know their killer had faced justice. Afterward, people dispersed quietly. There was none of the celebration that had followed the trial verdict. Death, even deserved death, cast a somber mood over everything. Alice walked Benjamin home through streets still covered in snow, their boots leaving tracks that would be filled again by noon. At the house, a pony and Weah were waiting on the porch. The boy had insisted on staying with them until spring, when he'd return to his people's settlement in the high country. A pony said it was because Weah felt safe here, in the place where his ordeal had ended. Alice suspected it was also because the boy had lost his mother and needed to feel part of a family again, even if that family looked nothing like the one he'd been born into. "It's done," Alice said simply. A pony nodded. He'd chosen not to attend the execution, staying instead to make breakfast for the boys. The smell of frying bacon drifted through the open door. "Come inside. You must be frozen." They gathered around the kitchen table, the 4 of them, and ate in comfortable silence. Alice watched Weah carefully spreading butter on his bread, his movements still sometimes hesitant, as if he wasn't quite sure this safety was real. Benjamin was teaching him English words, and Weah was teaching Benjamin Cherokee in return. They developed their own language of gestures and laughter that transcended words. After breakfast, a pony helped Alice with the dishes while the boys went outside to build a snowman. "I'll be leaving soon," he said quietly. "Heading back to my people. They need to know what happened here. need to hear that justice was actually served for once. Alice felt a strange pang at the thought of him leaving. Over the past weeks, his presence had become familiar, comforting even. When? Few days, maybe a week. Depends on the weather. He dried a plate carefully, his injured shoulder still stiff but healing. I wanted to ask you something first. What? Come with us. You and Benjamin. My people would welcome you, especially after what you did for Weah. You could start over, away from this place and all its memories. Alice was quiet for a long moment, watching her son through the window. Benjamin was laughing as Weah tried to roll a massive snowball, both boys red-cheeked and happy. I appreciate the offer, she said finally. But this is our home. Daniel built it with his own hands, and I won't let Martin's evil drive me away from it. We stay. Pony nodded as if he'd expected that answer. Then I have something else for you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. The money from the cabin. The sheriff said it should go to the victims' families, but the Cherokee elders voted to give a portion to you. For Benjamin's future, for the farm, for everything you risked. I can't take that. Alice stepped back. That's blood money. It belongs to the families who lost. It belongs to whoever can use it to build something good. A pony interrupted. You saved my nephew's life. You hunted down the men who killed my sister. This money can't bring the dead back, but it can help the living. Take it, Alice. Use it to make sure Benjamin has opportunities you never did. That's justice too. Alice took the pouch with trembling hands. It was heavier than she'd expected. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Thank me by living well, a pony said. By raising Benjamin to be a good man. By remembering that even in the darkest times, people can choose to do what's right. That's the only thanks I need. 3 days later, as Alice had known they would, a pony and Weah prepared to leave. The Cherokee boy had grown stronger during his time with them, the nightmares less frequent, the fear in his eyes gradually replaced by something resembling peace. But he still clung to his uncle's hand as they said their goodbyes. Benjamin hugged Weah fiercely. You'll come back in the spring, right? You promised to show me how to fish the Cherokee way. Weah nodded, speaking in halting English. I come back. We fish. We be friends always. The boys embraced again, and Alice saw tears on both their faces. She walked a pony to his horse, suddenly unsure what to say. Thank you for trusting me, she finally managed. For letting me help find justice for your sister and your nephew. Thank you for hearing him, a pony replied. For not turning away when it would have been easier. You're a remarkable woman, Alice Fairchild. Don't let anyone tell you different. He swung into the saddle, lifting Weah up in front of him. The boy waved frantically as they rode away, and Benjamin waved back until they disappeared around the bend in the road. Then he turned to his mother, tears streaming down his face. I'm going to miss him so much. I know, sweetheart. But he'll be back. And we'll write letters, and the time will pass faster than you think. That night, after Benjamin had cried himself to sleep, Alice sat by the fire and thought about everything that had happened. Just weeks ago, she'd been a grieving widow barely holding her farm together, her future uncertain and bleak. Now Clayton Birch was dead, Martin was buried, and she had money enough to secure Benjamin's future. She should feel triumphant, but all she felt was tired. Tired and old, and aware of how much darkness existed in the world, how thin the line was between civilization and savagery. She'd killed a man. She'd hunted another through the wilderness with murder in her heart. Those weren't things she could undo or forget, no matter how justified they'd been. Yet she'd also saved a child. She'd brought a killer to justice. She'd proven that even ordinary people, people with no power or authority, could stand against evil when they found the courage to act. That had to count for something. Alice stood and walked to the kitchen. To the spot where she'd torn up the floorboards to reach Weah. The wood had been replaced. the new planks standing out pale against the old. She ran her hand over them, remembering that desperate moment when she'd first seen those small fingers pushing against the gap. If she hadn't checked, if she'd convinced herself it was just rats, if she'd waited even one more day, but she hadn't. She'd acted when action was needed, and that made all the difference. Alice returned to the fire and picked up the book she'd been reading to Benjamin, a collection of Cherokee legends a pony had left as a gift. She opened it randomly and found a story about a warrior woman who defended her village against impossible odds. The story ended with a line that struck her deeply. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Alice closed the book and held it against her chest. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending snow swirling through the darkness. But inside it was warm and safe, and her son slept peacefully in his bed. Tomorrow she'd start planning improvements to the farm, maybe hire some help now that she could afford it. She'd write to Benjamin's aunt back east and see about getting him proper schooling. She'd live, and by living well, she'd honor the memory of those who'd been lost. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Alice watched the flames dance and thought about spring, when Weya would return, and the boys would fish together, and life would go on despite everything. The world was dark sometimes, cruel and unjust, and filled with people like Clayton Birch and Martin Fairchild. But it also held people like Apony and Sarah and Sheriff Davis, people who chose goodness even when evil would have been easier. Alice Fairchild had become one of those people. She'd looked into the darkness and refused to let it win. And if an ordinary widow from a failing farm could do that, then maybe anyone could. Maybe that was the real lesson here, the real victory. Not that evil had been punished, but that good had been chosen, again and again, by people who had every reason to give up. She banked the fire and went to check on Benjamin one more time. He was sprawled across his bed, one arm hanging off the edge, his face peaceful in sleep. Alice pulled his blanket up and kissed his forehead gently. "Sweet dreams, my brave boy," she whispered. Then she went to her own room, climbed into bed, and slept outside. The snow continued to fall, covering the world in white. And beneath it all, hidden but not forgotten, were the stories of 11 children who would never grow old, and one who would grow up to tell their tale. Alice Fairchild had made sure of that. She'd torn up her floor and torn down evil and proven that one person's courage could change everything. Spring would come eventually. The snow would melt, and flowers would bloom where blood had been spilled. Weya would return, and Benjamin would teach him to plant corn, and they'd fish in the creek and laugh like boys should laugh. Life would go on, as it always did, carrying forward the memories of those who'd been lost and the lessons learned by those who remained. And every night, before she slept, Alice would remember the sound of those small fingers scratching against wood. Not as a nightmare, but as a reminder. A reminder to listen, to act, to never turn away when someone cried out in the darkness. Because sometimes, all that stood between a child and death was one person who refused to ignore what they'd heard. Alice Fairchild had been that person. And in being that person, she'd saved not just Weya's life, but her own soul. That was enough. That was everything.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.